Hello and welcome everybody to this SAA October 2025 session. We're joined by Charlotte Wenner. Charlotte, thank you so much for coming and sharing your work with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's really such a thrill for me to be speaking to an audience with whom I'd otherwise never have any contact.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a great thing, and we're really delighted to have you share your work here with the SAA today. And a lot of our members will also be following on with the recording after. Just in case you haven't had the pleasure of meeting Charlotte before, she's a very early discoverer of astrology at the age of 15. She's US born, acquired an accredited degree as an astrological counselor in the Netherlands in 2001. She studied structural astrology. Is it with George Bode?
Boda, yes.
Bode in 2006 to 2008 and has lectured, taught, and published on this method internationally. We're so delighted to have you here, and I'm going to pop a link for everyone that would like to connect with you into the chat now, and I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you, JD. I'm going to start immediately by sharing my screen and get started with hopefully being
I'll
able
let you
to.
know when it's shared. There you go.
There we go. And we're going to get started here. Right. Um, so tonight I'm going to be talking about structural astrology, and I've entitled this talk Simplicity and Elegance, the New Paradigm of Structural Astrology. And as as JD mentioned, I was an early discoverer of astrology, and I've actually been practicing it for over 45 years. So that means I'm a lot older than I look. Well, I first of all started out my own practice called the Vlinderpraktijk, but it's now called the Astrology of the Invisible Luminaries. I've gotten a 5-year professional degree from Acela in 2001, studied with George Bode. And more recently, I've been teaching myself with a 4-year program here in the Netherlands called Celestis. I recently stopped so that I could devote my energies more to my own practices. And in May 2023, I published my first book, Structural Noetic Astrology, Part 1, which I revised this summer and is available on Amazon. So if you want to get more information about structural astrology that I'll be talking about tonight, that is your go-to. And I thought I would start out tonight with a little different introduction than perhaps most astrologers give. I thought I'd let you see what you're probably all curious about anyway, namely, what does this woman's chart look like? And I decided to share this because I'm going to start out with something that has been really on my mind since the first year when I started with the MA at the University of Wales Trinity St. David 3 years ago. And it was a talk by Robert Hand called Towards a Postmodern Astrology. So you can see that there's a lot of stuff here in this horoscope, which shows that I can either be fascinated by a subject or can even get a little bit obsessed, such as the stellium of Sun, Mercury, and Neptune in Scorpio in 1, Mercury in mutual reception with Pluto in Virgo in the 11th, with an accent on the 3rd and the 9th house, of course. So that means I'm really interested in learning details as well as broad ranged perspectives. And of course, Uranus is in a grand cross, if you count this as yet undiscovered planet, which I'll be talking about later. So Uranus, I very often associate with astrology, and you can see that that has always been a sort of burning passion for me. But back to Robert Hand and his talk. So in 2005, Robert Hand gave a talk at the Astrological Association called Towards a Postmodern Astrology. And one of the things that really stuck with me that I've been sort of wrestling with for the past 3 years is the following statement. Modern astrology has had one really tragic flaw in addition to its inarticulate language, and that is its complete lack of a philosophical foundation rooted in any coherent philosophical or spiritual tradition of the world. Now, that's a pretty big statement, but he's referring, of course, to the necessity of astrology to somewhat let go of its Hellenistic roots in Platonic, Neoplatonic, or Aristotelian philosophy, and in the 18th century. And to this moment, we still do not have a really coherent philosophy by which we can continue on in the way that he says we should have if there had never been a disruption. So I'm going to be talking to you tonight about the philosophical basis of structural astrology. And this might be a little bit of a news story, might be confronting, or it may be something you've been waiting for a long time. But my opinion is that in the present time, the new forms of science and academic research reflect the non-dual approach of structural noetic astrology. And as I talk, I'll be describing more what I mean by a non-dual approach. But in the summer, I also gave a talk about this perspective on Robert Hand's talk, and I spent a lot of time discussing what he was thinking about. But I decided in the meantime that I have to be much more simple about it. And as such, I reflect on the statement by Albert Einstein, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. So, thinking about it, I realized that Robert Hand is basically his advice for a postmodern astrology is that it must focus on consciousness. That was very important for him, while retaining the empirical rigor and clarity of its predecessors, as if its tradition had never been interrupted. So that's a simple statement, but it makes a lot of requirements on modern astrology. So tonight I'm going to briefly run through some of these thoughts with you as they pertain to structural astrology and start out with just a mention of why he feels this coherent philosophy is so important and why we have to look at a continuation rather than a revision or a return to something in the past. Then I'm going to briefly describe the background to structural noetic astrology. I imagine structural astrology is a new term to almost everybody here. And in that sense, it's important for you to get an idea of where it comes from before I start talking about why it is such a good form of astrology. So I'll talk about some of its relationships with modern scientific philosophies, basing interpretations on astronomical principles and astrological tradition, and looking at a non-dual approach, both on the hand of esotericism and science. Then we're going to get to Hand's first requirement, namely that astrology needs to focus on consciousness. And I'm going to describe the elements, the factors in structural astrology, which really go to the heart of the matter, that really are directly related to consciousness in the horoscope using a new structure and new objects. And finally, mention how this is not a complete revolution or nothing that is departing from tradition, but is actually a logical continuation and extension of the tradition based on modern astronomical and scientific discoveries. So for Hand, philosophy is essential. He says without a clear philosophy, it's impossible to, first of all, base astrology in a kind of justifiable basis or foundation. And at the same time, a clear philosophy will help direct the use of language so that it's very clear, and the techniques are also based on something which can be proven. So he is very clear on this. He says we don't want to use 19th century mystical philosophies, in quotation marks, such as those of Madame Blavatsky, Alice Bailey, and so forth, in part because they are not, in fact, foundational philosophies. He goes on to say that we have to go back to these philosophies, such as those of Plato, Pythagoras, Aristotle, Plotinus, and has roots in other philosophies that we cannot attribute to any actual person, such as the philosophies of Hermes. But my question is, can we actually go back to philosophies that were the product of a culture 2,000 years ago? Modern philosophers have argued that it is not possible, and it also reflects the sort of dialectic turn in anthropology, in that it is has been, and history as well. It has been um, uh, noted that when we look at information from the past, we do so through the glasses or the perspective of the culture that we have grown up in ourselves. So we impose that, our own meanings and our own interpretations on information from the past. Kuhn said, for instance, in Scientific Revolutions, that there are paradigm shifts in which things get completely changed, and incommensurability. Incommensurability just means that what was understood in a certain way in the past is impossible to understand in the same way at a later period. That some past ways of thinking just cannot be fully understood in terms of the present one. Michel Foucault said that each historical period has its own episteme, a deep structure of knowledge, and that is unique to each particular period. Certain beliefs are possible and others are unthinkable, and they are not easily translated into later frameworks. And Dominique Lecapre says that he limits historical appropriation. And he stressed that historians always have their own historical embedment. So that's why I argue, rather than trying to return artificially to a philosophy of the past, we need to appreciate that philosophy and look for current philosophies or ways of thinking in a current culture, which resonate with those same sentiments, which we can recognize, that's saying the same things, but it's from our own time, our own paradigm and episteme. So to get back to those early philosophies, the big difficulty is, of course, between the old argument between dualism and monism. So you have, on the one hand, you have the Plato, and you have the Neoplatonists, and also the Gnostics. They have this idea that there is a great soul, and that each of us have a part of that soul, but it's imprisoned in matter. So everything underneath the moon, the sublunary world, is actually flawed. And the best thing that we can do as humans is to ignore matter, to ignore the body, to look at these as things which need to be gotten rid of, and just concentrate on mind and returning to soul. Whereas on the other hand, you had Aristotle, who was a monist, and he said, no, there is no separation between body and soul. Soul is embedded in body, it is embodied. There is a higher mind, a higher aspect of soul, and the best way for a person to live their life is to use their mind to contemplate on its inner essence. what is unusual about Aristotle, which I might return to later, is that in his work, he does not actually have a term for person. So he considers the individual an sich to not be particularly important. There is no special designation for the self. So the person, the identity, seems to have been less important to Aristotle than many other philosophers who focused on that aspect. Another aspect of philosophy that we have to deal with as astrologers is, of course, Stoicism, which is a strict material monism, and the soul is almost ignored in this sense. And this gave rise to the later split, where when science says that soul is purely part of the church, and a determinist approach to astrology. And you see this, for instance, in the writings of Ptolemy and in Valens. They say, they always say, I think this is from the Tetrabiblos, yeah. For in the first place, we should consider that even with events that will necessarily take place, their unexpectedness is very apt to cause excessive panic and delirious joy, while foreknowledge accustoms and calms the soul by experience of distant events as though they were present, and prepares it to greet it with calm and steadfastness, whatever comes. So, this is pure Stoicism. You can't do anything to change your fate. The only thing is that with astrology, you know about it ahead of time and you can accept it very calmly. Later on, when astrology came to Europe, the split between soul and body became even more pronounced. The church took over all authority over the soul, and astrologers had to be very careful in making any kind of pronouncements in which something about the future would be said. So this split between dualism and monism is the soul outside of the body, is the soul inside the body, and superior. These are some questions that have plagued astrology throughout history. Now, Ptolemy tried to balance this difficulty by using the definition of knowledge that Aristotle had described. And I loved the beginning of Almagest, his astronomy book, when he says, for Aristotle divides theoretical philosophy, too, very fittingly, into three primary categories: physics, mathematics, and theology. In other words, you've got science, the measurement and observation of matter. You've got mathematics, which is numerology or geometry, and you have theology, knowledge of theos, of that which is holy. So Ptolemy is saying you have to have all three of those to have complete philosophical knowledge. For everything that exists is composed of matter, form, and motion. None of these three can be observed in its substratum by itself without the others. They can only be imagined. And this is really important to me because I think if we look at the history of astrology, you see throughout the history, various approaches either try to focus too much on the scientific or the empirical or the deterministic aspect, or you have other forms which are only related to soul, to transcending matter, to ascending to a higher order, but very little time in history when you see a balance. So these pictures are grossly simplified, of course, but you might say that during the Mesopotamian times when all of the omens came from the gods, so that was very much emphasis on theology. Esoteric, psychological, and modern astrology also emphasizes the subjective experience over objective aspects such as physics or mathematics. You also have here on the right the medieval time when they weren't able to say anything about soul. The astronomical reformers, such as uh, um, Kepler and Copernicus, and all those who focused very much on the physics, on the astrophysics, and very little on the theology. And then you have momentary times when there is at least some attempt to keep these three in balance. And in my opinion, that's what we really need to strive for, so that where there is sufficient attention for the soul, for consciousness, for um, internal and internal development, but also enough emphasis on the philosophy of science, and science which resonates with a world in which astrology is possible, and of course the mathematics, which has a surprising function that perhaps some people have not thought about too much. Robert Hand talks about the split after the reformists, so Kepler, Copernicus, and so forth. He talks about the time when astrology was not practiced actively or openly, at least in academic and scientific circles, not so much as the Enlightenment, but as the Endarkment. And during this period, let's say between the 18th and 19th century, up until the end of the 19th century, astrology really only survived by going underground and by, of course, continuing as it always had uh, for farmers who would look at the moon to find when they should plant in almanacs. And you also had, of course, the Freemasons who continued to keep the astrological traditions alive. The Romantic movement gave it more impetus, but we really did not get any kind of a resurrection until the Theosophical Society. And, you know, Robert Hand, he really sort of is disparaging about the Theosophical Society. And he doesn't have anything good to say about Helena Blavatsky or any of the others. But the truth be told, if it had not been for them, astrology may never have had the revitalization that we have experienced. And I would also even go so far to say that there isn't an astrologer practicing today who has not been influenced in some way by the transformation of astrology that was undertaken by Blavatsky and Alice Bailey, particularly. Alan Leo had a really, really fundamental role. Rudolf Steiner, Carl Jung also played a very strong role, and his theories were also very much in accordance with much of what the Theosophical Society was saying. And of course, Dane Rudhyar, who was perhaps the most important or most influential astrologer of the 20th century. And he got a lot of his inspiration, of course, from Leo's work, Alan Leo's, and the whole thrust of this movement, Alan Leo in particular, was by recognizing that if astrology was no longer being practiced in academic circles or in higher society or among scientists, that the only way that it would survive was to make it available and make it accessible to everyday people. And that's one of the reasons that he, and in France they had a Maurice Privat that did the same thing. They introduced sun signs, so you didn't even have to do any calculation to be able to start learning about astrology and to get an entrance into this manner of relating to the cosmos. Um, at the same time, physics and mathematics was pretty much kidnapped by the astronomers. So astrologers were by and large only left with theology, and that had, of course, positive results. The growth and self-actualization, the consciousness movement that we have seen in the past 100 years has truly been a benefit to humanity, in my opinion. But we have perhaps lost some valuable aspects of astrology, original astrology. First of all, by completely having it taken out of the scientific discussion. And also, with the coming of computers, there is less and less necessity for people to, first of all, to calculate the necessary planetary movements or house cusps, and also there's no necessity to draw the horoscopes. And this is actually, I'm just going to mention it briefly here. These two practices actually have a profound effect on the brain. I was looking it up yesterday that doing mathematics, doing calculation, actually it takes a lot of concentration, but what it does, it connects all the different areas in the brain at the same time. So it's an incredibly empowering and an positive effect for your brain, for brain connection and brain usage to engage in making calculations. This, of course, raises intelligence. At the same time, you've got, on the other hand, the drawing of horoscopes. Drawing geometrical figures actually brings your brainwave state down into alpha, which is a sort of meditative state. And in my practice, actually drawing these horoscopes and entering all the information into them brings me into such a meditative state that I'm really able to connect with the energy of the chart much better. So these are two sort of, they look like small things, but in terms of mathematics, these are two things that we have lost more recently, especially with the coming of computers. So what we have now is a split between astronomy and astrology and the place of philosophy. Philosophy is, of course, philo and Sophie, that basically means love plus truth. But astronomy without astrology is not complete philosophical knowledge because it only includes physics and mathematics, and it has removed knowledge of God, of theology, of soul, of consciousness. So it is not complete. And as Ptolemy said, it can only, it goes into imagination. Astrology without astronomy is also not complete philosophical knowledge. It's almost exclusively theology, so investigation of the subjective inner soul or consciousness, and a monologue, so only talking with itself. Theology only conversing with itself becomes a monologue. And if, as Alan Watts said, if you talk all the time, you'll never hear what anybody else has to say. And therefore, all you'll have to talk about is your own conversation. So at a certain point, if we only focus on the subjective experience with astrology, it's going to be an endless circle in which a lot is just repeated, and we need fresh inspiration from outside sources. So classical objective science provides quantitative information about the external universe. So we need that information about planets, about measurements, about orbits, etc., to be able to use astrology effectively. Esoteric or subjective science provides qualitative experience of the internal universe. So, in my opinion, what we really need to look for in astrology is a way to blend these two universes, the external, the physical, the material, and the internal, the invisible. Science helps us to integrate with the outer world, physical safety. Spirituality helps us to integrate our inner world, internal well being. And one of the prime characteristics of life, the prime differentiating factor of life, as I recently read by a neurobiologist, he said, is the urge to remain. So that means that the urge to remain is that which moves life to want to integrate with its external world, to protect itself, but also make use of it. And at the same time, it has to maintain homeostasis, its internal world. So this shows us at a very basic way of life, there has to be some kind of combination of external and internal world. So how are we going to bridge this impasse? How are we going to get beyond the division between science and spirit, matter versus consciousness? And for me, the past 50 years, I'd say at least, have become increasingly exciting in the world of science. And I'm going to just briefly touch on a few theories that I've come across, which I feel make astrology create a paradigm in which astrology is not impossible, as Robert Hahn says. So we need a philosophy in which astrology is not impossible. And I'm saying that the philosophy of modern science is actually offering us some good space to be able to do that. So I'm just going to touch on a few things with quantum physics. Take a look at non-dual naturalism, which is something I just ran into last week. Take a look at the life of the model of life sciences and reflect on how that is related to a horoscope or astrology as a model of life. And I also want to touch on non-dual hermeticism, which is again something I just ran into the past week, and for me is really exciting. So when I talk about non-dual naturalism and non-dual hermeticism, this shows me that it is possible for spirituality to join hands with the physical, and for the physical to join hand with the spiritual. So the truth is that there is not inner and outer, but in order to live as consciousness, those distinctions arise. So basically, we are all expressions of life. And as that is the basic energy of the universe. But as soon as we become conscious of ourselves, immediately there arises this separation. And that's what has given rise to the idea that there is something different between us and the rest of the world. But both spirituality and science are beginning to say those borders are actually not as firm as we used to think. In order to talk about all of this, of course, we have to be able to use concepts. And that's where the disagreements come into place. Every time somebody wants to talk about truth, talk about what is true, we use our own form of our own concepts, and these can get misunderstood. And that's what's happened in the past. But let's take a look at what modern science is offering us these days. Well, most of you probably know about some of the theories that have come out in quantum physics, which suggest that, first of all, that separation is illusory, and secondly, that consciousness is permeates all of reality, or at the very least, all of reality is sensitive to consciousness, which would suggest that it is consciousness itself. But I can't go that far. The really strict scientists are very unwilling to say that consciousness is the universe is conscious. But anyway, the one of the um, prime theories coming out of quantum physics is about entanglement, namely, if two things that have been connected and are later separated still have instantaneous communication. They are still attached in some way. And this was the way I explained the way astrology worked to me when I first started out in 1975. I was also a big fan of Carl Sagan, and he was really anti astrology. And I was thinking, oh, how is this possible? Because I love astronomy, but I love astrology too. But when I read about the Big Bang, it made perfect sense to me that if everything originated from an original original source, that there would remain a relationship to them. Now, that may not be the best scientific explanation, but it was good enough for me at the time, and it is mirrored by the theory of entanglement now among quantum physicists. You have the quantum observer effect, of course, or the Copenhagen explanation, when it's been shown that um, quantum particles re, 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 behave in one way if nobody is observing them, and observe in another react in another way if there is an observer. So if nobody is looking, it remains a kind of vague wave or cloud of information. But if there's somebody observing it, it becomes a particle. And this is what is called the observer effect, which suggests that consciousness has an effect on creating particles. And you have also David Bohm's holographic universe, in which every part contains a reproduction of the whole. This is also something like fractal theory, in which everything continually is recreated with the same fractal calculation. So all of these theories really create a kind of universe which the Hermeticists could have said, as above, so below. It would have fit right into these theories. That the planets are what happens with the planets is reflected here on Earth, which the Hellenistic astrologers said this would fit completely in these types of theories. So this is one thing that I think provides a lot of uh, possibilities for astrology to fit into the modern quantum scientific philosophy. But I mentioned also that I recently came across a doctor at Oxford, I believe, James Cook, and he practices non-dual naturalism. So he basically, without going into it extensively, because I already mentioned it somewhat, but everything consciousness is what makes in some way reality. For instance, he says an apple is not red for a fly. So different forms of consciousness see an apple in a completely different way. So there is no way that we, as a particular form of consciousness, can say, this is the truth of what an apple is. And he goes even further. He says, in fact, there is no red. This is just what we can observe with our physical apparatus. It's how our brain and our eyes interpret the waves, which are called infrared rays or color rays of energy. So, in fact, consciousness is that which makes these things. Um, and this is useful for us. These concepts are, of course, useful for us because it helps us figure out if something is good for us or if it is not. So this is a basic aspect of life and why consciousness is directed toward forming concepts of life. But The map is not the territory. The other thing I mentioned that is bridging the gap is a different look at Hermeticism. So, Wouter Hanegraaff, who is a professor here in Amsterdam, he's proposed, he's been studying Hermeticism for many years, and he's recently come to the conclusion that translators of Hermetic texts, which, by the way, are not any older than the 14th century. So those Hermetic texts that we do have come from the 14th centuries, and they are copies from texts of a text from the 11th century, which has been lost, according to Hanegraaff. So we don't have any originals. So these have all been translated later. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we impose our own cultural expectations, prejudices, understandings, and whatever onto older things in the past. So those translators in the 18th and the 19th centuries, 15th century, they were all deeply steeped in Christianity, of course. And they made Hermeticism, they mistranslated it so that it looked a lot more like Gnosticism rather than, as Hanegraaff says, the non-dual type of spiritualism that Hermeticism really is. So the Gnostics, they were really very, very close to the Neoplatonist. So they had the soul, the old theory of Plato's theory of soul, and it descended through the seven spheres and taking on all kinds of daemons and problems and things like that until they were incarnated in the body, which was, of course, very evil and misled the soul by its passions. And the Gnostics were really very negative about the world, about the body, about everything material. But and Hanegraaff says this is not the way that Hermeticism actually was oriented. Hermeticism was actually about aligning the higher soul and expressing it in the body. So really that the body and the material world, the purpose is to make it more beauty, to bring more beauty into the body, more health, more beauty, and to bring more beauty into the world. So there is no division, in his opinion, between spirit, matter, soul, and body. And the adept's task, he says, is to purify perception. So this again gets to the heart of what Hand mentions about consciousness being central. You see that astrology is potentially a, a method for us also to achieve a purity of perception and to have a rebirth in the new or becoming all things. And this expresses the non-dual state of consciousness, which is similar to Advaita Vedanta. So those non-dual forms of spirituality from the East. The last bit of science that I wanted to share with you, which I think is important, is to look at the current discoveries of the biological sciences. So nowadays, there are many people saying that if you want to look for the real breakthroughs in information about reality, you don't have to look at astrophysics or at physics, but you should look at the life sciences. And Fritjof Capra wrote a couple of really good books talking about the systems theory of life. And he boils down the essential aspects of life into three categories. First of all, you have pattern or organization. That's the configuration of relationships that determines the system's essential characteristics. You have structure. That's the physical embodiment of the system's patterns, the tangible components such as cells, organs, ecosystems, etc., that realize the organization. And then you have, of course, the process or the life process. And this is the continual activity of life, the dynamic flow of energy and matter that sustains the structure and maintains the pattern in a continuous process of self organization and renewal. So when I read about this, I thought, wow, that really sounds like three of the main components of astrology. So we have organization, the overall configuration of relationship of planets and their aspects. We have a structure that we put these planets into, so the 12 signs and the 12 houses. And we have life processes. We have the cycles of planets and their returns, transits, and progressions. So looking at it this way, I was thinking, this looks like also an interesting way to consider the horoscope scope as a kind of map of life. All three of the elements that Capra discusses are fundamental aspects of the horoscope. And what I really, really like about Capra's theory is he uses Ilya Prigogines, can't say that correctly, concept of dissipative structures and systems on the edge of chaos. So what he's saying here is what they've discovered is that life does not exist as a kind of fixed, firm, harmonious, static entity and then just die. Actually, life is constantly dissolving and reforming, and it's a really rather chaotic sort of situation internally in cells, I mean, not souls, uh, although souls can also get chaotic sometimes, but in cells. But through this chaos and through the life form being able to create order out of that chaos, higher level of life, higher levels of organization are achieved. And I thought, wow, doesn't that just sound like when you have a transit or a difficult progression or something, and your life seems to be falling apart, but you're able to get through that. And once you do, you've arrived at a completely new sort of form of life, a new kind of balance. And so that's what I thought is another look, a group out of the scientific hat, which can help base our practice in relevant philosophies from the scientific world that resonate with astrology. So I just wanted to close this section with a beautiful quote from David Bohm, who is really wonderful to read. He says that intelligence and material process have thus a single origin, which is ultimately the unknown totality of the universal flux. I love that. The unknown totality of the universal flux. While it is thus clear that ultimately thought and thing cannot properly be analyzed as separately existent, the distinction between what is real and what is imaginary or illusory is absolutely necessary, not only in practical affairs, but also if we are to maintain our sanity. So, in other words, even though in truth the universe is just fluctuating information, waves of information, it's necessary and useful for us to see things as things and to approach them as such. And that is why astrology can be very useful in helping us um, attaining the internal balance that will help us through these chaotic periods in life. So, what does this whole theory of non-duality mean for astrology? Well, practically, in order to describe the changing experience of the individual based on a correspondence with movements in the heavens, the holographic universe, the astrologer uses a map, and this map helps describe the changing experiences here on Earth. However, in order to be of value, it must be a good map. And that's the whole discussion that astrology is struggling is how do we get the best map? And there are all different opinions about this, all kinds of reforms that have gone on through history. And at the same time, I believe it's important for astrologers to remember that the horoscope or the map is not the territory. So we can have a horoscope. I say this also to my clients all the time. You know, that is a picture of potential and a picture of impressions and things which have shaped the life you live, but it is not the same thing as you. It's a piece of paper, and we can use it to get more information about what is really going on with you inside. So it's like that old Buddhist phrase, it is like a finger pointing at the moon. It will never be the moon, the finger will never be the moon, but it can show you the way there. So let me turn now to structural astrology and how that relates to these new scientific theories, this new look at Hermeticism and postmodern astrology. Well, in the 20th century, I already mentioned that theosophical and esoteric approach to astrology was pretty much the only thing that was really getting any traction in the public and was getting any positive reception among the public. There were, however, some serious attempts in 20th century, particularly German, Dutch, and French astrologers who tried to bring astrology back into balance. So I mentioned that one of the drawbacks of the heavy emphasis on theosophy, on subjective experience, on soul and transformation, was that there was no mathematics, or there were still some mathematics, but very little emphasis on a sound philosophy of now and any kind of scientific foundation. And that's what the German, Dutch, and French astrologers were trying to do. They were trying to bring a scientific rationale back into the astrological discourse. You had, for instance, Alfred Witt and the Hamburg School, and Robert Hand even mentions him in his talk as having at least developed a system which you could test. That was one of the things that Hand was most disturbed with modern astrology. He says the predictions are all very vague. The language is very vague. You can't really pin them down or test them empirically. He said, the Hamburg and the Uranian schools, on the other hand, they've got some theories. You can actually say this is right or this is wrong. So there were some positive aspects of these developments at the time. What's also very interesting is that the first trans-Plutonian hypothetical planets that Witt came up with were the same as the three that I'll be talking to later on that structural astrology uses. He called them Isis, which we call Persephone, Vulcanus, which we call Vulcan, and the Black Moon, which we, of course, have as well. You had Reinhold Ebertin, who had the 90-degree system and cosmobiology. And here in the Netherlands, you also had Theodor Johannes Ram, who was involved in long-term planetary cycles as a way of providing a scientific basis for the truth of astrology. In France, there was particularly a very strong emphasis on trying to get more of a scientific basis. And Dom Néroman, which is the nom de plume of Pierre Roger, he took up the challenge as the successor to Chouinard, who was the first to really argue for a reintroduction of a scientific basis. So Néroman proposed a modern, internally coherent structure, which was based on science. He also retained a theological component, namely, he tried to trace humanity's evolution by looking at various planetary cycles. The interesting thing about Néroman is that he was the first to realize the implications of the uninhabited of Kepler's elliptical orbits. And so he came up with the black moon, which was located at the apogee of the moon's orbit, the black sun at the aphelion, and the bendings of the lunar nodal axis. And he came up with the two trans-Plutonian planets, Proserpina and Vulcan. There was a dark occult symbolism that was attached to the black lights, but this was the result of Néroman's students who followed the example of, followed in the footsteps of Safariel. So Safariel was the first one to call the black moon Lilith. He wasn't referring to the black moon of Néroman. He was referring to Waldemoth's black moon. I don't have enough time to go into that now, but I discussed this at some length in my book, The Different Three Black Moons. So an associate of Don Néroman was Jean Carteret, and he was considered pretty much a mage in intellectual circles in the France of 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And this is a quotation which I see I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go through it as I would have liked to. But just this first or second part, he says, my seeing or knowing, my act through the word, is made of transcendental anthropocentrism. For me, everything is internal in man and his consciousness, because it is a matter of knowledge, of gnosis, illuminated by the dialectic of logic, and possibly by analogy. So this was the guiding principle of the origins of structural astrology. First of all, the dialectics, but also consciousness, the internal knowing. And he paired up with a philosopher of the time, a structuralist, Raymond Abeliel, and they set up a school called the oh, my French is really terrible. Let's just call it CEM with Carteret. And he talked about what the difference was between deterministic astrology and symbolic systems. He said the astrology based on influence is unilateral. So, in other words, the deterministic model of astrology, which came down to us from the Stoics and from Plato, that the planets exerted a power on us, was unilateral. The stars are the causes to which humans are subject. But symbolic astrology introduces a dialectical transference. The stars influence us, but we in return influence our stars. Symbolic astrology selects a finite number of relationships on the entirety of infinite relationships. Structural astrology goes one step further in the sense that it encompasses the play of relationships. It defines this interaction while in symbolic astrologies, these relationships are unlimited. In other words, the difference here with modern symbolic astrology is that it does not uh, select a finite number of relationships. It leads to indeterminate an indeterminate number of possible relationships, whereas structural astrology focuses on a particular few. And he says Jean Carteret is the great force behind this approach to astrology. So this is a quick look at Jean Carteret's horoscope, and I'm just going to focus on the traditional points here that you see. You see that he's got a Neptune on his ascendant, and Uranus is opposite. Saturn is conjunct his MC. He was never one to really want to conform with authority. And the Sun is square the ascendant. So that shows that he was the need for him to uh, bring his identity to the world was very much in a dynamic relationship with how he acted, his personality. The Lord of the Ascendant, the Moon, is conjunct Mars and is square the Pars Fortuna. The Lord of the MC, Jupiter, is in 12, and you've got Pluto in 12. So this shows a deep ability to have growth and understanding of the greater whole. And you see Sun, Venus, and Mercury conjunct the zenith. So those are all very important. He had a very strong love of communication, and he had a need to communicate with the world, with the way he saw things. His north node is in 3, the south node in 9. So communication and knowledge and higher knowledge were also strongly aspected here. We're going to look later again at his horoscope to see if the new aspects from structural astrology give us any more precise information, because of course, it's easy to say, oh, yeah, you're Neptune on the ascendant. Of course, he was spiritual. But Joseph Stalin had Neptune in the first two. Bill Clinton had Neptune in the first two. Marilyn Monroe had Neptune in the first. So I'm saying this because very often people grasp at something that looks like, oh, this made him the way he is. But actually, the thing about structural astrology is that we don't just grasp at one thing. We look at really a definite number of specific factors in order to say, yes, but what made him specifically the way he is? Now, I found out about structural astrology through George Boda, who is a Dutch astrologer. He's still alive. This is a recent picture, and I meet with him frequently to continue to discuss what I'm writing and what I'm saying. And he met Carteret in 1962 in Paris when he was working as a journalist. And they had a 15-year collaboration on this new astrological system, which combined esoteric thought and scientific development. So you had the philosophy of Raymond Abellio, for instance. They drew on the first principles that were outlined by Ptolemy. You had from Adherence, another Dutch esoteric astrology here in the Netherlands, who also had 2 groups of 7 planets, which you're going to see later. And you had the cyclical relationships between planets and house cusp rulers from T.J.J. Ram, who was also more of an esotericist. So Robert Hand is very big about astrology, a postmodern astrology, being a continuation, as if there has never been an interruption in its tradition. And in this graphic, I try to show how many diverse traditions have all found their ways into structural astrology. On the left hand, I've got the more mathematical look at astrologer and causal. In the middle, I've got the more divinatory or more theologically based. And then on the right, you have the completely theological, so esoteric framework. And all of these have somehow been bits, the parts that work, which Robert Hand suggests are what astrology should carry forth, namely those aspects of its predecessors that have proven to work. These have been all integrated into structural astrology that George Boda has presented. Just a few examples, for instance, we've got dialectical structuralism. And here on the left, I've got a few citations from former traditions. For instance, Plato writes in Timaeus that the creator caused the celestial bodies to move in dialectical fashion, vertical and horizontal, to the right and to the left. You also see in the book Hellenistic Astrology from Chris Brennan that the distinction between benefic and malefic planets, while not the only area in which contrasts are used, this distinction allows us to establish significations of the planets by setting up binary pairs that are capable of representing both that which is signified and its opposite. So this unity of opposites, this binary division in Hellenistic astrology is also fundamental. In the introduction to the absolute structure, Abelio states that in order to proceed with any structuring of a way of knowing, so transcendent consciousness, any way to structure consciousness, we have to give ourselves a field and designate 4 poles that can effectively be mobilized in a dialectic. And Carteret also mentions the dialectic between intersubjectivity, in which the subject prevails over the object, and also when the object prevails over the subject, and linking those two. One aspect of interpretations of structural astrology, which is important, is that we do not rely on myths, which has become a tendency in modern astrology. So we find a new dwarf planet like, and the astronomers call it Eris, and they say, oh, let's use the myth of Eris, and then we'll say what that means in a horoscope. George Boda found it very useful to follow the example of the chemist Dmitry Mendeleev, who was able to propose many non-discovered elements by basing their properties and atomic weights by hypothesizing them based on the characteristics, the qualities, and atomic weights of elements that were already known. So structural astrology makes interpretations based on what is already known, based on astrological tradition and astronomical fact. So we come to the black moon, for instance, and the way the structural astrology interprets this. Now, we look first of all at the astronomical basis of this. It is the point closest to the empty focus of this ellipse. So Kepler told us that orbits are not circles, but they're these oblongs. And that means that it doesn't have one center, it has 2 foci. Now, the one that is inhabited is the Earth. The other is empty. That's energy. It's an energetic calculation. And in a way, it is the silent architect of the moon's motion. The black moon is located at the aphelion, which is the closest point to the empty focus. So that makes it the farthest from Earth, and it's when the moon is the least moonlight. Like, what does that mean? When the moon is the least moon-like, that means that it's the most independent from earthly impressions. It's no longer a satellite, but self-determining. It's not dependent on the expectations and conditioning of the earth, but is in touch with the universe, what is universal knowing and being. So the black moon is actually that point at which the consciousness in the individual is in relationship with the consciousness of the universe. So it is this knowing of the essence of life. However, it's most recognizable in everyday psychology in the principle of rejection. So the black moon not only rejects that which is merely conditioned or imposed upon by earth or earthly conditioning or society, but it is rejected by. So the individual often experiences some kind of experience with rejection, primarily in the house where the black moon is found, and secondarily in the sign. The meaning that structural astrology has for the black moon can be related to Eastern traditions. It represents that form of consciousness which is not the one who thinks or feels or who reacts, but the one who observes the thinking, the feeling, and reacting. It is the witness. It is that aspect of our consciousness which witnesses what the earthly consciousness is thinking and doing and feeling. It's that aspect of consciousness with which you know something without articulation. It is knowing, it is awareness. Opposite the black moon is, of course, the point in the moon's orbit which is closest to Earth, and this is called Priapus. And at the perigee, the moon feels the most moonlight. It's a mere satellite without any independent existence, completely focused on and perfectly synchronized with earthly expectations. It's the principle of adaptation and the point of most utmost fertility, where things go easily and without effort. So by house, this is where things just go easily, that you can do automatically without having to think. It's something you learned early and you can do it really easily. It's what was accepted. When you experience rejection of the black moon, you went to behavior that was accepted, especially as a child, and learned to get along with your environment. It's the fall from original unity to the habitual repetition of the known. It's the aspect of consciousness that imitates in order to develop an ego, which is, of course, necessary to survival. So I've got this little graphic here. You might want to think of Priapus, which is here at the bottom. That's that aspect of consciousness which is always thinking about the known past or the predictable future, about the body, about people, about things, places, or times. Never here and now, always then or in the future. The black moon is that now. It's always now. It's aware and it's not focused on bodies, peoples, or any of those known things. And I'm trying to give you an idea about the way that this type of consciousness actually can be experienced in everyday life. The structural astrology also has the black sun, and it's similar to the black moon. It's based on a geocentric astrology, of course, so it looks like the sun is going around the earth. And you have at the aphelion, you've got the black sun here, which is closest to the empty focus. Now, the sun in the horoscope is the individual. It is the identity. It is that which makes you unique. When the sun at the aphelion, the black sun, sun is the least sunlight. So it's the point at which the sun can leave the planets and go off into the universe with all and just become another star. It's no longer important. It's just one of the other countless billions and billions and billions and billions of stars. So it's incredibly unindividual. It denies egocentrism and is completely universal. The black sun is uh, can be thought of as a field of endless possibilities. So, in the house that it's in your horoscope, it offers a kind of there's a kind of fascination with the things that are in this house, and it's in these areas that you can go all different directions, and you'll be called to investigate all kinds of different new ways of being. Because it's undifferentiated, it can also lead to a kind of chaos or lack of clarity in the house that it's in. In Eastern traditions, the black sun is like the totality of consciousness, being the state of presence that is impossible to communicate. It is that experience of gnosis. It is that which is identical with the universe. It is eternity. It is the realization of consciousness. I am everything. At the opposite point, closest to the earth, you have the diamond. So once you've gone into these universal spheres, the master is not finished. The master has to come back and to be able to communicate or to share that which has been experienced in the universal. And this is something that is unique to every individual. It is the path by which one perfects oneself as much as possible. And that can be in a variety of fields. In my particular in my particular case, my black moon is in the ninth house. So I've always been called to bring my higher vision of philosophies and the meaning of life, to bring it down to the diamond in the third, in which I communicate it with people and write books. Because that's the funny thing about the black sun and the diamond. Well, the black sun can give you a kind of chaos in the house that it's in. The diamond shows your secret ambition. And it's really funny. You may not have ever thought about the house in this way, but if you look for your diamond, you might be able to recognize that that is what you secretly would really love to do or be. So the more you're able to develop the diamond, the less life seems to happen to you because you use every experience to further become conscious. So if you know it makes one extremely selective, not only about the types of experiences, but also the kinds of interaction you have with other. Know thyself, and you will know all. And this is the experience of at 1 month. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm probably going to start speaking more quickly. So I have a similar kind of graphic here. You see the black sun is out there in the universe with no body, nothing, no place, no time, just an unending field of energy and possibility. And when you bring that back down to earth, back down to now, that is the diamond that is at 1 month. So I'm not going to have enough time to mention much about this, but you will see here in John Cartier that he had the black sun here on the first house. So this really intensified the whole Neptunian signature that is there, that makes he is a potential channel into his identity, is a potential challenge for universal information, but it also makes him a little bit a chaotic individual. And if you look closely at that picture, which I showed you earlier, you can see that he was a little bit of a mess in terms of personal hygiene. The diamond was here next to Uranus. So his perfection of path of perfection was to share this with others, to find ways to refine the universal information and share it with others. His black moon, where he was rejected, was here in groups um, and in friendships and associations. So he was never really able to fit into other groups of astrologers or associations, and he had to deal with that. His Priapus here in focusing on his own personal creativity in House 5. Now, these 4 points form a path to enlightenment, and this goes in a dialectical process. You begin with the black moon, you have the fall to Priapus, you look for other ways of being at the black sun, and finally refine that into your own unique expression of universal truth at the diamond. It is at this point that you're able to reclaim the original intuitive knowing that you had when you were born. Sorry to go through this so quickly, but I want to get through this on
All right,
time.
Charlotte.
So you see that this
Use your
is
time. Use your time
uh,
as you wish.
it also follows sort of a time path in your life, that the rejection comes at childhood when you're being yourself, and that isn't appreciated. And you have to learn as a child and as an adult to get along with the conditioning, but you get sick of that. So you look for other opportunities. You go into the wide world of unlimited possibilities of the sun and black sun until you find something that resonates with you, and you focus on that and perfect that in you until you reach mastery, and you reclaim also the black moon essence with which you were born. We have a similar dialectic with the lunar nodes. So I mentioned at the beginning that we incorporate the bendings, which were also used by Ptolemy and Vettius Valens, but we give them a name. So the bending, which is the most southerly, is called the beast, and that is unchanneled maximum amount of energy. And that which is most northernmost is called the dragon. And that's the absolute crystallization of form. Um, so I've written an article about this, which I shared with the CIA. And if you go to my site, I can possibly even share that in the chat if you'd like to read more about how this works. But basically, you can think about it as a cycle of creation if you're at all a kind of artist. So you all know that if you want to do something creative, you have to wait for that burst of inspiration. And that is the unchanneled, unformed inspiration that suddenly pops in. And that comes when you're aimlessly musing, you have vague ideas, and suddenly you have that eureka moment. And that is what we think of as the beast. Then you come up with concepts. So you think, okay, how can I give this inspiration some kind of form? So you go to your south node. What have I got? What are my skills? What kind of resources do I have? And you start giving it a form, you start shaping it until you've got your first draft. You bring it into the world, and that's when you've got you develop the work or the artwork according to the concept. You make some adjustments and improvements at the north node. When you give it to you bring it into being, and you publish it, you exhibit it, it's completely finished, and that's the end of the cycle when you reach the dragon. And it's at that point that you have to let go. So you can't stay fixed there, but you need to share it with the world, promote it, publish it, and release it. You have either success or failure. And at that point, you have to go back to the beast, where you just wait in the wasteland for the next inspiration or the next creative force. So these dialectical cycles show that consciousness is really at the center. We have the black luminaries and the lunar nodal cross at the highest level of astrology. Then we've got physical and the material to express physical physical events, and we focus also on self actualization and the universal energetic process. So, this is also from structuralism. Sancerre had a structure for linguistics, and he divided it into three tiers. And we do the same thing with astrology. We have the metaphysical tier at the top, and we have the transpersonal level, which is the highest, and the personal. Then we have the second level, which is the physical emotional realm of the sun and the moon. And then the lowest tier, the physical level, where you have the personal planets, Mercury to Saturn, and the physical transpersonal planets, Uranus to Vulcan. So I'm mentoring Vulcan. Yeah. Oh, I'm never going to have enough time to finish all this because I've only got about 2 more minutes. Suffice it to say that we have also reintegrated the Pars Fortuna horoscope. So that's the horoscope that is made with your Pars Fortuna as the ascendant and the planets in the houses that are made with this new ascendant. And that helps to focus the undifferentiated potential from the radix into the pars fortuna. It shows the destiny, if you will, related to the individual embodiment of spirit and soul, that of mind and heart. And finally, just going to mention that we have a new structure of this universe based on 2 as yet undiscovered planets, namely Persephone and Vulcan. So we have the physical planets, which are energetically directed towards the formation of the emotional identity, and we have the non-visible planets of Uranus to Vulcan, which are focused on the process of enlightenment or self-actualization of the black moon and the black sun. This also leads us to a new system of sign rulerships, which brings balance back into the original system of sign lords or planetary lords. Ptolemy and all other traditional astrologers had 2 signs for each planet, except for the luminaries. Now that we have the black luminaries, the signs of Leo and Cancer also have a second ruler. But apart from this, you'll notice that the pairs, the sign pairs also have planet pairs. So there is a complete replication or a reflection in structural astrology of the visible and the invisible, the physical and the spiritual. And this leads us from a dual perspective in which we can only hope to escape the body and rise to the universe into a complete torus of energy in which we give and receive. We become an electromagnetic light in the universe. And this is when we join both the physical and the invisible or the immaterial. And we have the dual rulerships of physical and non-visible planets for each of the signs. The last thing I wanted to say is just that structural astrology also makes use of 23 factors, which corresponds to the 23 chromosomes, which are so unique about humans as a mammal. Other mammals all have 22. We have 23. So we've got the 7 physical planets, we've got 10 uh, invisible planets, which includes the black moon mean and black moon true, Priapus mean, Priapus true, the black sun, and we have the 6 aspects of the highest level of metaphysics. So this was all inspired for me in my own personal search for truth. I have lived for many years in Asia. I lived in Urmey at one of the holy mountains, spent some time in Lhasa before spending 2 years in Kathmandu, coming to Europe and becoming a Buddhist meditator. And from 1997 on, it was always a big question to me, how can I balance non-duality, the realization that the universe and the physical and the non-physical are all one great energetic consciousness. How can I balance that with my practice as an astrologer? And that I have given form in structural noetic astrology, which I have tried to make a little bit clearer for you here tonight. In December, I'm going to be giving a free online introduction to a 7-part online course in the foundations of structural astrology. You can find my revised edition of my book on Amazon, and you're always welcome to contact me at any of these sites. My website, I have a Facebook page, YouTube channel where I put up a lot of different more uh, delineations using structural astrology, and you're always welcome to mail me as well. So I know I've run a little bit over time, and I ask your indulgence for that. And if there are any quick questions, I'd be happy to answer one or two before I have to go.
Charlotte, that was really fascinating. So much really cool stuff that you shared in there, and a lot of meaty stuff for people to dig into. I think some that were interested in a more just wanting to make sure with the I think the only thing that wasn't clear to them was the how do you calculate the diamond?
Yeah, oh, good questions. So the opposite point of the black moon we use is Priapus, and that's always directly opposite the black moon mean and directly opposite the black moon true or true Lilith. But the black sun, now this is what's so cool about it. So this is when astronomy really supports our interpretation. It's the slowest moving object in the horoscope. So it only moves about 1 degree every 100 years. So that means everybody in the 20th century, born in the 20th century, has the black sun at 12 degrees Cancer. And the diamond is always directly opposite. So 12 degrees Capricorn. In the 21st century, it's now moved up to 13 degrees, where a Cancer and Capricorn, where it's going to stay all the 100 years. Thank you
Okay.
for asking that.
Yeah, thank
But
you.
that also reinforces that it's absolutely not individual. When I was teaching, my students would say, "Oh, look, I've got the black sun in Cancer." I said, "Everybody has the black sun in Cancer." So it really shows that it's really that object in the horoscope, which makes it actually possible for us to recognize the universe and be the universe. It's yeah,
Yeah,
really
that's really
universal.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, and equally, I guess the thing that would be unique for people would be the path to go there, right? Because that is going to be a little bit more
Excellent. Yes, so that's why
specific.
house placement takes precedence on sign, because it really shows from going from the black moon. So if you're looking at your own horoscope, try and go back to, okay, is there anything about this house that was sort of rejected if I were to express myself in this area as I truly see it? For instance, if I, with my black moon in nine, if I had told my religious parents what I thought about their beliefs, I would have had a big trouble. So, you
Yeah,
look for that, and then you get a handle on where that started. And then you can look at Priapus. Okay, how did I adapt to that? What did I do to make myself more? And then you can start getting a feel about how that works in your chart.
yes. Yeah, I like that a lot. I mean, I have a lot of little comments and question things myself, but I'll just send you an email around it rather than clogging up the time because I know you need to go.
Okay, well, again, you're all welcome to get in touch with me if you have a question. Mail me. Check out the introductory course, introductory online lecture on the 16th, and
Mhm.
well, I hope to see you all again in the near future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Charlotte. And I'll stop the recording there for people that
Okay,
follow along. It was really meaty and really fun to hear you go through all of that. Thanks again.
okay. Got to get to bed now. Morning,
Bye
six
now.
o'clock is coming soon. Bye bye.
Bye.